Okay, so last week we talked mainly about discrimination, consumer, employer, employee, the different impacts in the labor market that it had. So today we're going to talk about kind of amateurism, or mainly the NCAA. We'll think about some of the unique issues they face, and eventually talk about the labor market in relationship to players as well. What happens if we open the labor market to allow players to be paid? So, without any further ado, so if we kind of go back in time to amateurism history, thinking about non-professional leagues, really what it starts is the Olympics, right? So initially, it starts to kind of honor the gods. Although the first Olympians weren't true amateurs, so a lot of the time cities rewarded them with money. A lot of them trained full time year round. But it really started if we go to American colleges and we look at professionals in crew, right? So it's kind of popped up in the Ivy Leagues with their crew teams, where you saw some really high levels of competitions when professionals started to go to these colleges in order to compete, where they could receive prize money. They would get admissions just for kind of the pursuit of athletic, exercises, so they're making a living off of this. Basically playing some sport for colleges. So athletic departments, we can think about today, right? So they kind of started from this original idea of people started to go to these colleges because there's high amounts of money to be made in these competitions, which there still is today. When you think of athletic departments can experience profits, while other departments within a university usually operate as non-for-profits, right? But if I'm a non-for-profit, anytime I experience profits, what can I always do? Well, I can always just spend the additional money, right? If they're going to take the money from me, I can just spend it on additional things, right? Spend it on recruiting, spend it on higher coaches' salaries, you name it. I can always spend the money, and so if I know it's going to be taken from me, we should see a lot of these colleges not operating as necessarily profit maximizers, but win maximizers, right? So, we kind of just look across the league and think about maybe things that we've already talked about before, but in relationship to the NCAA, since we've mainly focused on professional leagues. Specifically, we're going to be thinking mainly about the two sports that generate the most profit at the collegiate level, which is football and basketball, right? Specifically men's basketball. So if we look at football, easily generates, for most schools, the highest revenue. The largest school, and I've got the data we'll kind of look at here in a second in Excel, but the largest revenue generating school, I can't remember the year I have in the data, it might be 2015, so I'm sure these have changed a little bit, but it was $100 million in Texas. So the smallest school, if we look at kind of Division I schools, was Dayton, right? So we've got a pretty wide range there. If we look at the top 5 kind of revenue and the top 5 profit, and the way I'm kind of denoting profit, the schools reported their revenue. They also reported their expenses, right? So ultimately, this profit probably goes back into the university at some level, or helps subsidize some of the other maybe athletic programs that the school has. So it's not necessarily that the school is profiting; they might be spending this money elsewhere, just not on their football program. Okay? But we can kind of look at kind of the teams. They're the teams that you would expect to be up there. Kind of your highest revenue generating, kind of older programs, large followings. If we look at basketball, that's another one that is a high amount. But compare the largest revenue generating team in basketball, which is Louisville, compared to largest in football, which is Texas. I mean, more than twofold, right? Twice as large. And if we look at the smallest basketball, actually it happened to be also Dayton. But notice there's not as wide a range, right? Dayton's making $500,000 from their basketball program, while they're only generating about $200,000 from their football program. So we see a smaller range of in the data for basketball revenues. We look at the top schools; they're a little bit different than what we had in football, right? So there's kind of some of the highest revenue generating basketball programs are not any of the highest revenue generating football programs. So we have some variation in terms of specialization, I guess, of these schools and what sport they kind of specialize in. So kind of interesting, just kind of look at the data here. So despite being the largest revenue source, expenses are highest for football and basketball as well. So are they profitable, right? So if we go through and just look at, the reported men's revenue and reported men's expenses to determine if we can, if the accounting profits are zero. Looks like the mean is around 5.3 million for football. Median is 0, so most of these schools aren't turning a profit. And actually only 48% of them are in fact earning a profit if we look at the revenue they've generated minus the expenses, right? So only about half of these schools are turning a profit. Same kind of thing for basketball. Slightly higher percent are generating a profit, but really, 40, 48, not a big difference, right? Where the median is 0 too. So it doesn't appear as though they're very profitable. They're generating crazy amounts of revenue, right? I mean, even the smallest over $500,000, but it doesn't appear to be that most of them are generating profits, right? So where's the revenue sources coming from? We can think a little bit more about why or why not they might be profitable. Okay? So before we look at that, I do want to show you the data because it is kind of interesting. So we have this sports expense data, which I'll put this up on Canvas if you want to open it as you're watching this. So let's go. I want to go to View. Let's make this a little bit bigger so we can all see it a little bit better. All right, so this is just has a bunch of different schools. I said I grabbed 1 year of data here. I guess it was 2012, not 2015, right? But if you go to the original data here, it looks like I have quite a few years. It looks like 2003 to 2012 or so. But here it's going to focus on 1 year. You can kind of sort it. Remember, we've talked about this before. All I did was highlight, so select the very first cell, A1. Control Shift, or in the Mac Command Shift, hit over, then down. That selects all the data. We then go to Data, and then we filter all the data. Right? So I can then kind of sort these by, I think this was basketball expenses squared, basketball profits. Should have basketball revenue somewhere if I calculate all that. Because I might have just, hold on. If we look at all the data, here we go, team revenue. So I could sort on team revenue, smallest to largest. I kind of filtered out from the ones that I had shown you on the slides. I filtered out all the Division II schools. I just didn't think it was as interesting, kind of to focus on Division I. But you could sort these any way you wanted to. So if I go largest to smallest, this is how I kind of identified who the largest revenue generating programs were for basketball. So notice here I've got University of Louisville for 2010, 2011, and 12 was the highest. I'm sure you could break this down by year. Right? I could filter this so I could say who had the highest in 2010. So now it filters it by year, and it's also sorted it, and so I can see, okay, these are the top revenue generators. So you can play around with that filter tool to really investigate the data a little bit further. All right, and then, okay, so go back to the slides here. So where's this revenue coming from? Ticket sources are a large source of revenue for a lot of these programs, especially when we're talking about some of the larger football and basketball programs. Their stadiums are comparable to the size of the stadiums for professional leagues, and so you can see a lot of revenue coming from this. Teams. One issue that was limited in NCAA with NCAA football teams and basketball teams, quite often they can't really change their location, right? They can't. They're not going to build a stadium that's in a different state from what the university is. So they can build new stadiums potentially, and they can change capacity, but they're somewhat limited in terms of they can't. Their opportunity costs are what is potentially very high, right? If the school could move, right, their basketball program to a larger city, say let's say Ball State wanted to move theirs to Indy, right? That could be beneficial in terms of the fact that there's a higher average income, higher population in Indy. But right, it's not near the school. In terms of the travel of their student body there may not be practical, and so it's a little bit kind of don't have that issue to think of. We don't really have a location change we can make. If we look at ticket sale revenues, one interesting thing is they continually increase, and it appears that they're kind of increasing even more so than inflation. So from 2010 to 2015, if we look at the data, ticket sale revenues have increased for the major conferences. So when I say major conferences, I'm kind of talking about the Power Five there, as we say them. So I'll probably forget one, but Big Ten, ACC, SEC, Big 12, and I am forgetting one. Big Ten, ACC. Well, I'll have to double check. I probably have it on a slide here, but I forgot one of them. Let's see. I feel bad now, but I can't remember off the top of my head. What conferences do we have here? ACC, Big 12, Big 10, Pac-12 is the one I forgot. Yep, Pac-12. So they've risen quite a bit. Kind of looking at the highest to lowest. I mean, the lowest school kind of generating about 500,000 ticket sales, while the highest generating 63 million. I don't remember specifically who this was, but once again, I'll have this subsidy that I can put up online. I pulled 2015 out of it, and it has revenue broken down by different sources. So here I've got ticket sale revenue. So I think I already have this sorted. Yep, largest to smallest. So it looks like 63 million. That was the University of Texas, right? So again, I'll put this up on Canvas. You can play around with it. It's pretty interesting. So see, a big chunk, right, comes from ticket sales. I think if we go back and look, total revenue for Texas was 100 million. Well more than half of it's coming from ticket sales, right? And if we wanted to, in that Excel file, we could break down the percent of total revenue that's coming from ticket sales as well. Okay. And maybe we'll play around with that a little bit so I can give you some idea of how we use Excel more with data for your project. Okay. Licensing revenue is also a pretty big portion. It's up a lot. It's increasingly becoming a larger proportion of overall revenue. So 67% increase from 2010 to 2015 across all the teams. Much higher variation than in ticket sales, because with ticket sales there is different demand for the different teams, but we don't see a lot of these lower teams, even though they can get some money from their ticket sales, they're not getting any licensing deals, or the smaller conferences aren't making these huge licensing deals, while the larger Power Five are, right? So allowing each of these conferences, or each of these teams even, I think specifically like Michigan, it has a deal with Air Jordan, and I think, I might get these wrong, but I believe Notre Dame's with Adidas, right? That these individual teams can sign with a specific company. Well, that's going to cause more competitive imbalance, because the largest schools and the largest funds are going to be the ones that those companies reach out to, giving them even more money, even more revenue that they can then spend on recruiting, facilities, and things like that. So we look at the highest licensing revenue, it's about 63 million. Lowest licensing revenue is about 2 million-ish, and so we see a lot more kind of variation. See a lot of variation in this licensing revenue. I mean, there's quite a bit in the, oops, there we go, if I can go back here. Quite a bit in ticket revenue as well, but just looking at the range, it looks like it's similar. But if we look at the actual standard deviation on that, we can see there's maybe a high variation. So how can we do that? Well, let's go to the Excel file. So I've got, let's see. This is actually, I think, not just the, I misspoke earlier. This is not, this is sales for the entire academic program. So let's go to, if I remember right, or is this just, no, this is the whole program. So let's go down here. I'm missing a few schools, so it's okay. So let's look at like the variance. We'll say this is the population, since we have every school from 2015. We've got a pretty high variance there. If we then want to look at, what was the other one? Ticket sales. So that's in column D. Var.P, so that's taking the population variance. I'm saying population because we have every school here in these conferences. Notice that variation that exists in licensing is a lot higher than in ticket sales. Right? And we can look at the other sources of revenue too in this Excel file, which we'll talk about here in just a second, and they're kind of labeled as such. So So that's kind of proof that there's more variation, even though the range looks somewhat similar. Much more variation here when we actually look at a better measure, which is like the variance or the standard deviation. Broadcast revenue is becoming an increasingly larger portion as well. So a lot of teams have their own regional sports networks. So on each Power 5 conference, the 5 that we kind of mentioned earlier, have their own networks that bring in additional money just to that conference, right? And so just going to that conference, the larger conferences that have a larger following are going to then have even more revenue, which then allows them to kind of increase spending on players, facilities, coaches, increase their quality, and kind of grow that competitive balance gap, right? So making competitive balance worse. However, so this is where we start to talk about kind of different measures of competitive balance. So across the league, allowing these broadcast deals for each team to make their own, or allow these conferences to make their own, might cause poor competitive balance across the league, right? Because the best conferences will be able to earn even more money and kind of widen that gap in revenue between the other conferences. However, within the conference, right, when these conferences make a deal and then give it out evenly to each team, well, that helps improve competitive balance because now every team is getting equal amount of money. And so you're talking about if they were making individual contracts, say, within the Big Ten, the University of Michigan could have probably gotten a larger broadcast contract with someone than, say, the University of, I don't know, who do I want to pick on today? Maybe Illinois or Northwestern, right? And so if they're all getting the same amount of money, this helps improve within conference competitive balance. But worsens it across, right? So some teams do have their own TV deals. Notre Dame, specifically, Texas has kind of this Longhorn network. This obviously, like I mentioned, if it wasn't done by conference, it was done by team, this is going to help, decrease competitive balance both within and across conferences. And Notre Dame's a little unique in the sense that they, up until recent years didn't belong to a conference, and even now don't 100% belong to their conference. So there's also additional money that might come in, additional revenue that comes in from bowl games, NCAA tournament success, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. But kind of some of that we wouldn't really classify necessarily as broadcast revenue, but it is revenue that's coming from having additional games broadcasted. And like I said, we'll talk about this in a second in terms of the rewards for bowl games and NCAA tournament success and how that affects competitive balance. So if we look at the actual data, you can kind of see Big Ten, SEC, and the ACC, really large broadcast revenue. Big 12, Pac-10, it's not like they're that far away, but even within the Power 5, you can see that the SEC is likely going to pull away, right? And kind of help decrease competitive balance as a result. So, usually this is a really fun time because the NCAA tournament is going on, but right now we don't have that. But we can think about the impacts the NCAA tournament has and success in the NCAA tournament. Additional TV revenue or revenue generated from being in the tournament, how that would impact things. Okay, give me 1 second. Dog didn't want to be in the room anymore. So, in 2010, we're just kind of looking at some of the numbers that have been made. The NCAA tournament, with CBS and TBS, the NCAA itself, like as an enterprise, signed a 14-year, almost $11 billion deal. So in 2011, 2012, the NCAA received $680 million for this tournament. So we're talking outrageous sums of money. And if we look at the NCAA, that was 90% of their total revenue that year, right? Now, I'm sure this has changed a little bit with the, in terms of the percentage has changed with the creation of the college football playoff, but, right, you can see the NCAA tournament, especially before that, was almost all of the revenue generated for the NCAA. In 2016, the contract was kind of renegotiated or extended for another 8 years, another $8.8 billion. So kind of notice if we just look at the amount per year, this extension was, they're paying a little bit more, right? And more so than just covering inflation. So does this deal help improve competitive balance, Well, we have to think about, okay, the NCAA is getting all this money. Does it go back out to any of these teams? And if it does, which ones? Right? So 60% of the revenue goes to the colleges directly. The amount the college receives based on the number of scholarships they had available, and therefore actually would worsen competitive balance, right? Because the schools that are going to have the largest number of scholarships available are going to be the schools that are kind of larger, have higher revenues to begin with, and so if the money is awarded based on the number of scholarships, we're going to see kind of competitive balance get even worse. Right? But there's part of it that may help to improve competitive balance. Right? And so that part is not the kind of just TV revenue that's given to every team based off of the number of scholarships, but it's the portion that's given in terms of, the portion that's given out as performance awards. So I believe these are all the up-to-date numbers. I know they were up to date as of 2017-18, but here we can see that in the NCAA tournament, each conference receives $1.5 million for simply having a school appearing in the NCAA tournament. Well, if we read a little bit about how the tournament works, every conference, even not just the Power Five, these small conferences all get automatic bids. So if I get an automatic bid and I just get 1.5 for simply having a school in there, well, then each conference is getting the same amount of money equally for that first team in there. So this is going to help improve competitive balance, because once they have a team show up, the Big Ten getting 1.5, is not near as marginally effective as when, I don't even know the name of there's one like we could say like even the Sun Belt Conference getting their first team in, it's going to have a marginally much larger impact. So that's just for getting one team in. That kind of helps improve competitive balance across the leagues and within, because the conference is getting this money and then separate it evenly among their teams. So this first bullet point helps improve within and across conference competitive balance. So each tournament win earns a conference an additional $250,000 for the next 6 years. So now we start thinking about how would this rule impact within and across competitive balance? Well, within competitive balance, whatever conference wins it, they get the additional $250,000. They split it evenly amongst their teams. That's going to help within conference competitive balance. But what conferences are more likely to have a higher number of wins? Well, higher revenue generating, higher quality conferences, which then means they're going to get even more money, spreading that gap even further. So this is going to help, decrease competitive balance across these conferences. Now, if we look at kind of the amount given, each conference, you can see the SEC, Pac-12, ACC, Big 12, Big 10, even the Big East, right? These are all kind of quite a bit higher. If we look at like the really small conferences there, and I actually pulled this up on a website so we can kind of take a look at this here too, right? I don't even know if it has like the American, right, only got $4 million. Okay, so I had to splice this in. I had a small error. I'm trying to set hotkeys, but what I was mentioning at the time was if I wanted to look at more up-to-date kind of data, there's this website here. I will put this in the slides, and I'll repost the complete version of the slides, where you can look at, for 2019, kind of each conference's payout. Most of the big Power Five are $100 million or more, while as we look at those smaller group of five, they only had a $90 million collective pool split amongst all the teams in all five of those conferences. So we saw much lower amounts kind of given to those conferences, which hurt competitive balance. So it was just me kind of voicing over this web page that had more up-to-date numbers that really showed how the Power Five benefits from the way that the college football playoffs and college football bowl games pay out the teams. Initially, when I spend money, it has a huge impact on wins. Eventually, as I spend more and more money, right, the number of wins I can kind of obtain, or quality I can obtain, is kind of censored, right? I kind of approach that, but the marginal impact of spending an additional dollar, if I think about this as a dollar, hardly any change in the number of wins. But down here, if I spend an additional dollar, huge change in wins, right? So as I spend more and more money, that impact on wins is likely going to diminish, meaning that 1.5 million given to the smaller conferences is going to have a larger impact. Right? Okay, so we can think about similar impacts from NCAA bowl revenue. So the BCS and playoff games are kind of, this was instituted because they knew there was a high demand come playoff time for these bowl games, and so they're going to reward the teams that make it into these because they're generating a lot of additional revenue for the NCAA. So teams get $6 million just for making it into one of these playoff games. Conferences receive. So if I think about that, how's that going to impact within and across competitive balance? Well, here it's not the conference doesn't get the $6 million; it's the team. So this is not only going to impact within conference competitive balance negatively, right? Because now the best teams have the highest likelihood of making the playoffs, and they're going to get even more money to spend their program to increase quality. But across conference competitive balance, what conferences do you think are most likely, especially given the kind of selection process, to make it into these playoff games? Are the Power Five, the Big Five conferences that generate the most amount of revenue. So this is going to hurt within and across conference competitive balance. Conferences also receive money for each bowl game they have a direct tie-in. So it's not just the playoff games, but any bowl game that conferences have a direct tie-in supplying a team to. And when I say tie, I don't mean like the result of the game, just like there are certain bowls where it says, the second place Big Ten team is going to be in this bowl, right? And so they get money for that as well, and most of these are the larger conferences. So once again, this hurts across conference competitive balance, but because the money's going to the conference and they spread it out evenly amongst the teams, that's helping within conference competitive balance. So teams get additional 2.8 million in stipends as well for bowl games to cover expenses. So whether or not that their expenses really are that high, I haven't seen the data on that, but I'm guessing some of that money gets pocketed. I don't know if they meet that expenditure amount, or if they're told they have to spend it. I'm sure they spend it on some pretty frivolous things, right? So we kind of look at some of the results. In 2019, the Big Ten got $90 million to split evenly amongst the teams. So that was just from all the bowl games they had direct tie-ins with. And so that's a pretty good amount of money. And if they split it evenly across their teams, it's really going to help shore up within conference competitive balance. So within improves, but then across is going to worsen because the team or the conferences that are going to have more teams in these bowl games will be the higher quality conferences to begin with. So we look at some of this is the one that I did have pulled up. Sorry, I got that confused earlier. But you can kind of look at, there we go. So like the Big Ten, these are some newer numbers from 2019. I think the 90 million was from 2016. So let's start with the ACC. And I apologize for these ads. But this is like what? This looks like 80, 90, almost 100 million the ACC got. Looks like the Big 12. So the base payoff for just the games they're tied in is quite a bit. And then this is the additional money earned from being in things like the Sugar Bowl. Here we've got Wisconsin being in the Rose Bowl. Average annual payout. I mean, this is huge amounts of money for these guys. This is like over 100 million, over 100 million. Then we get down to these smaller. Like the American gets 4 million total. Only 4 million. That's not very much. The American Athletic Conference USA. They have some deals to supply some teams as well, so there's this $90 million collective pool that they can divide amongst themselves. Notre Dame being kind of a little independent in 2019, got $3 million. So independence. You can kind of see that it helps. It's not going to help improve competitive balance when there's a group of 5 conferences here, the Mountain West, Sun Belt. They have to divide this $90 million amongst themselves, while as the SEC itself is getting, 130 some plus million just to distribute between just its teams. So, it's not going to help improve across conference competitive balance very much. So, if we look at some of the benefits or the impacts of this college playoff, what problems might it cause if the goal of the BCS is to generate the highest revenue? Well, you're always going to have a bias towards large conference teams. So even when you're deciding which teams make it in, let's say they all have the same record and look very similar, you'd always want to err on the side of, well, what team could generate more revenue? You hear a lot of people, even just within general bowl games, not just college playoff, arguing that for more well-known teams, it tends to be that they get into larger or kind of higher quality or more esteemed bowl games, and that's because the goal of the BCS, the goal of the NCAA is to generate as much money as they can. How can they do that? Put teams that have a higher following, right, or teams from these larger conferences, put them in the primetime bowl slots, right? So this is going to give less money to these non-major conferences, which is going to hurt competitive balance across the leagues. So if we look at kind of bowl payouts, and this is a little bit older data, and we kind of just looked at some of the payouts on that web page, and I'll put a link to that in Canvas as well, so you can get the more up-to-date version. But you can kind of see, right? Mountain West, the WAC conference, they're making much less money than these Power 5 conferences, right? And that's just from bowl revenue. Okay, so let's a little bit more talk about a lot of the revenue or kind of revenue sources of these programs. So what about the costs? Right? What are the costs of college athletics? Well, athletic departments, if you think about their costs, it's really going to be one of the main ones you might think is labor, right? But what are labor costs here? And labor costs are essentially to the program, to this athletic program, are essentially zero, right? I mean, I'm sure there are minimal costs to providing players with but it's not really, they're not spending the money on the labor. They have to buy jerseys and things like that. But to actually pay the players, they're not paying them anything. The university's giving them a scholarship, but that's not coming from the athletic department. Right? So we have kind of a zero cost for their labor, but they are going to spend money on other things, right? They're going to spend money on their stadium. They're going to spend money on recruiting. They're going to spend money on their apparel, right? On their the way their team looks, on their coach. So what's going to happen is essentially it's always better to be the department that spends more specifically on recruiting, right? And we've talked about this a little bit in terms of how game theory would predict this prisoner's dilemma, where we're both spending more money to recruiting. It's going to end up being kind of this arms race. So athletic departments are essentially, they kind of put into their budget 14% of scholarships, but right, like I said, the real kind of cost there is zero, because if they give the scholarship, they get zero money from the student. But if they didn't give the scholarship and that athlete decided not to go to the school, well, then what's the difference in cost? Right? What's the difference, right? There's no opportunity cost there. Now, if the student would have went to the university without the scholarship, well, now there is some cost, right? So, essentially though, if you think about that, every athlete, and it makes the most sense probably at these major universities, if you don't give them a scholarship, they're probably going to go somewhere else that gives them more. So really, the marginal cost on labor there is really zero. You're not losing out on anything by giving them a scholarship, and that doesn't really cost you anything, right? In terms of the athletic program. Now, how can you spend more on labor then? You can't pay them wages. I think now there are some stipend amounts you can give to athletes, but you can't change that. It's not a scale. I can't say give one athlete $20,000 as a stipend and the other one $60,000, right? So how can I spend more on my labor? Right? How can I improve the quality of my labor? Well, I can give them a scholarship, but after that, what can I do? I can try to attract them, right? So if I think about the cost, I'm kind of glossing over this a little bit, but what's the cost of scholarship? If the student wouldn't have attended otherwise, they're not displacing another student. Essentially, it's zero. Right? So what do I spend money on to improve my quality of labor, or to spend more money on labor? Things like recruiting trips, improving my facilities. If you just Google search some of these, especially football facilities in terms of weight rooms and locker rooms, I mean, they look just crazy. They're spending a lot of money on these to attract higher quality players because they can't attract them with higher wages. Okay? But we could think about, it's not just wages. So if we think about the labor market, maybe if I can't provide you just wages, but I can, if we think about, let's see if I get this. There we go. So think about the quantity of labor here, and then the we'll call them wages or kind of comp for compensation. Right? So remember, the supply curve for labor, or the demand curve for labor is whatever the value of that player is. So if we think about the supply curve, right, it was the marginal cost of supplying labor, right? So supply curve for labor. But if these wages don't just include things like, it doesn't just have to be money, maybe this is like the marginal benefit to the player, right? Or kind of how much, what's the additional, like not just the wage, but maybe wage plus utility that comes from something else. So could I put a dollar amount on how much that person would have paid to have a locker room of this certain quality that that program has? So you can think about this as maybe not the equilibrium wage, but kind of maybe some measure of like equilibrium utility, right? I don't know if you can kind of see that raised a little bit. So it's U star, right? So we can offer things other than the wage to players in order to attract them, right? Okay, so all right, where were we at? So if we look at the expenses that their teams are spending on these facilities, you can see that they're increasing quite a bit, especially when you compare it to other operating expenses. Some, you could even argue, have resorted to illegal payments, right? And there are some schools who've gotten in trouble for this, and this is because how can I attract the higher quality player? Well, if everybody is kind of locked in to only being able to provide them with a scholarship and whatever the value of facilities are to that player, if I can give them any type of a wage, and any other school is kind of playing is not going against the law, is playing legally, well, then I'm always going to have a higher valued offer to that player, right? And so that's why kind of making these illegal payments, we could probably set that up. Now there's a huge incentive for teams to do that as well, and we kind of have a prisoner's dilemma where both programs would have an incentive to do it, unless, similar to steroids, we increase the cost of getting caught, right? Or increase the probability of getting caught, or increase the cost if you do get caught. That's two ways in which we could kind of stop this Nash equilibrium or this prisoner's dilemma from occurring. Nash equilibrium of a prisoner's dilemma, which would be, sorry, not a prisoner's dilemma. Okay, so if we kind of go back to revisiting these athletic departments' profits, one thing that's interesting is that 72% of all BCS schools, their athletic programs are profitable, which means that about 30% aren't, right? So if I'm looking at just the revenue generated by the athletic department and I take out their expenses, it looks like 30% of them are actually operating at a loss. So how is this possible? Okay. Well, there's other revenue sources that the team doesn't generate, but that come from the university. So these are come through things like subsidies and student fees that money directly goes to these athletic programs. So if we don't include scholarships, right? So first of all, if we just don't include the scholarships, because like we said, the real cost is actually zero, so those shouldn't be part of the expenses, about 80% of the athletic departments are profitable. And if we start to include things like student fees, that percent just starts to increase more and more, right? So let's see. I've got that subsidy data. So that subsidy data, if we kind of look at, let me see if I did I've got a bunch of stuff over here that we're not going to compare or kind of mess around with. But we could create a column, which is, right, student revenue. So the way that I calculated profits here, or the way you would, is these student revenue. Let me see if I have it. You would take total revenue, you would subtract the subsidies and subtract student fees, and that would tell you kind of whether or not the program was profitable in terms of if they didn't accept any money from the university. Now, if you then include subsidies and student fees as additional revenue, you'll see that the percent of schools that are profitable, right, goes way up. Right? Now, you'll notice some of these schools have zeros, right, for their student fees, and some of them have zeros for subsidies. So let's think a little bit harder about what schools those might be. So what schools do you think might require larger student fees? Well, if we're thinking about these student fees and subsidies are trying to kind of take a non-profitable school and make it so that the program can exist, right? We can't operate at a loss forever. It's likely going to be teams that are generating less revenue, right? Or aren't generating enough revenue from their athletic department to kind of cover their expenses. So smaller conferences are probably going to be our culprits. Sure enough, if we look at like FIU, Old Dominion, and Ball State, right? Ball State has about 50% of its revenue in its athletic department comes from student fees, right? So whatever its revenue is, the school is kind of charging students an amount such that the total amount they generate from their students is exactly half of the total amount of revenue that's coming from the athletic department, right? Or it exactly matches whatever the athletic department was generating. FIU is even higher, right? 70%. Then Old Dominion, right, has student fees the highest, which were 28 million. So I don't remember what Ball State's were. You could actually figure it out right now. So if we go to, where's the school name? Oh, here it is. So let's go A to Z. We'll sort it. Let's go to Ball State. Their student fees are what? $5 million. Yeah, $5 million is coming from. Oh no, nope, I lied. Their student fees are actually, holy cow. So we put a comma here, comma, so $11.5 million. Right, not the highest. Bowling Green was the high, or not Bowling Green. Old Dominion was the highest, but pretty high amount coming from student fees there. Okay. If we then look at what percent of the major conferences, right, Power 5, what percent of their revenue comes from student fees? Well, 26 of the schools in the Power 5 have absolutely $0 generated for student fees. So, we could look at the average. Once again, I'll kind of show you how to play around with that filter tool. So let's say I go, okay, I only want the ACC, Big 12, Big 10, Pac-12, and SEC. So I select those conferences. It only shows me them. I then say, okay, where's that student? Let me see. Where's this? Okay, here's the student fee. I'm going to go down to the bottom and say, I want you to take the average of this column. There's some blanks in there. Some of the schools didn't report, but the ones that did, it looks like it's an average of only 5 million. So quite a bit lower than the other schools we're looking at. And even within those, probably, it looks like some of the schools are really pulling that average up. Like this is it's like 4 million. I guess it's, here's a school it's pulling. Yeah, looks like Colorado is similar to Ball State. Looks like Rutgers is similar. So there's a couple schools that are kind of heavily influencing this. And I'm guessing some of the ones we don't have data on, there might be a few more zeros in there. So I'm going to unfilter this again just so that we can see all the conferences. Yep. Okay, and then I'm going to sort the student fees, large or small, just so we can say Old Dominion, Central Florida, Georgia State might be kind of one of the more surprising one that has a large amount of their revenue come from student subsidies. So, walk through that. So what are some other subsidies? Well, other subsidies amounts are here we go. Oh, never mind. So other subsidy amounts is not just money directly linked to student fees, but money that the university has that's being kind of given, maybe not directly from student fees, or not an amount from students that are guaranteed to go to the athletic department, but just money coming from the university other than that. So, if I had high student fees, I don't need to rely on this other subsidy. So it's kind of this trade-off, right? If I have $0 coming through student fees, I might need to get additional subsidy revenue from the university. So there's a trade-off between the two. If we look at Old Dominion, they're a perfect example of this. So Old Dominion, student fees, they're getting quite a bit, 28 million. But if we look at kind of what the subsidies are coming from, school funds, right? Or we look at subsidies. Sorry, like if we look at their total subsidies, it's exactly whatever their student fees are. They have $0 coming from other school funds. Right? So these other school funds this is kind of a trade-off, right? So if I have 0 from other student funds, I might have to have really high student fees. Whereas the opposite could also be true. If I've got zeros in here, I may, $0 from student fees, I may have to be getting some additional money from the university. And some of this is just semantics, because just because it's not earmarked doesn't mean that the majority of these subsidies aren't coming from tuition payments. But there is kind of this trade-off between the two. All right, so we've seen that in the data. We also have donations or contributions. So the average contribution amount was about 12.12 million. Lots of variation, pretty high standard deviation there. FIU had the lowest contribution, while you had schools like Texas A&M. I forget who this was in 2015. There was a really large donor. But you can see these schools that are getting the highest amount of donations are really large schools. And so if we look at donations or contributions as a source of revenue, once again, those are likely going to hurt competitive balance within and across conferences, right? Because the larger, higher quality schools are more likely to get higher levels of donations or contributions. It would actually be really interesting to look when you do have like an abnormal contribution made to schools like Texas A&M. This probably bumped them up from kind of the rank they usually are. Try to see how that impacts kind of the quality of the team, because it's like this exogenous shock, right? These schools are putting out lots of high quality people every single year, and so they're more likely to have a large contribution come in down the road. If we think about smaller schools, they just don't put out as many students or as high quality students, so they may not have these really large contributions coming back down the road. All right, so we're about 50 minutes in. Okay, so college sports started out controlled by students. NCAA kind of started to prevent professional athletes from selling their services to colleges, so they don't want these pros like coming in and saying, look, I'll row for, I don't know, Harvard if you give me X amount of dollars, right? They didn't want that. They didn't want college sports to be a career. And so they couldn't quite deal with it themselves, because if they outlawed it, it would always be advantageous for one of these schools to be the only one that's putting on these professional kind of matches. And so kind of a prisoner's dilemma, where it's better for both of us to just play in this game and pay for these professionals. So they needed a central agency or kind of a regulatory agency of the NCAA that could then prevent, right? We all come to an agreement, and this central organization holds us to this agreement that we're not going to allow professionals to play in college sports. So the NCAA is essentially a cartel, right? You've got multiple, it's really organizing the interests of all these different schools or companies. And so cartels usually try to organize output decisions, which allows them to control prices and increase profits. But it also allows them to act as a monopsony. And this is kind of one that's been of more focus in recent years, as what the NCAA for college athletes, and specifically because some of these leagues have had rules that you had to play a certain number of years in at the collegiate level or in any amateur level in order to then play in the professional league. Kind of those rules combined with the NCAA acting as this cartel really allowed them to be a monopsony, right? They have monopsony power. If you wanted to play football 2 years after high school, you had to play or where could you be the most successful or have the highest probability of making it to the professional leagues and making lots of money. The only organization allowing you to do that is the NCAA. So you kind of only have one employer, right, or monopsony power, which we know with monopsony power, we've talked about this prior, that's going to keep wages lower. Right? So we think about the output of the NCAA is, so what output are they organizing? Was really the number of games to be supplied, right? Or the number of games to be put out there. And the way it's going to make this decision, it really operates off of this aggregate marginal cost curve, right? So there's some overall marginal revenue or demand for the sport, and then the marginal cost is essentially, they're going to add up the marginal costs at each quantity level, each number of games of every single team's or for every single team, right? So kind of a nice visual of this is, here's team A, here's team B, right? They would have supplied the first game at very low cost. This team needs a much higher amount in order to supply that first game. And so what is the optimal number of games, or kind of quantity of output here? We've got marginal revenue demand. We know the NCAA is a monopoly for this amateur sport, and so it's where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. But what marginal cost curve? Well, at every kind of pricing level, we would take the quantity supplied from all teams. Here we only have two. We can imagine we could have teams A, B, D, E here, and we then add those two quantities up to get, sorry, not add two quantities up. We add the two marginal costs up. At that marginal cost, we would add up the two quantities supplied there to get our aggregate marginal cost curve, right? So at each marginal cost, we're adding up these two quantities to get the third, or kind of shown up here as well. So we then make our decision based off where marginal cost equal to marginal revenue. And you can kind of see this is the optimal number of games to kind of be supplied. Right? Now, obviously, I said we have more than just teams A and B. We have multiple teams in real life, but this is a pretty good depiction of it. So I already mentioned this a little bit, so I'll probably go over this kind of quickly. But the NCAA has monopsony power. Player movement is greatly restricted. Even if you want to move teams, you sometimes can lose a year of eligibility to sit out, and so this allows teams to really act as monopsonists. You incur these additional costs if you try to move teams. Leaving the NCAA professional leagues is restricted. I already mentioned this, where it's required you have to stay in this league for a certain number of years, and so this really gives monopsony power to the league. So results in lower wages, potentially fewer number of players. How can they do that? Fewer number of scholarships offered, potentially. So that's really kind of what their monopsony power is going to look like. I'm going to try to decide where I want to go here, how much more we have left, and what I want to do tomorrow. We have a decent amount. So I do want to talk through the standards, the academic standards today, and then we'll stop there. So the NCAA, right, sets academic standards, right? So this is kind of like them setting some rules for these teams. So in order, it wants to preserve this idea that these are not just these aren't just athletes, they're student athletes, right? And so there's going to be some academic standards. So one pro is that it enforces this idea of they're student athletes. The con is that it creates barriers to entry, right? And it potentially doesn't allow certain athletes to even participate, right? So the qualifications for an athletic scholarship is some sliding scale of GPA and SAT. Now, I will say, this is the last time that I looked at this was true, but now that schools aren't requiring SAT scores, I don't know if it's if it's optional. I'm sure there's some other rule where it's just based off of kind of your GPA. But there is kind of these qualifications for these athletic scholarships. In fact, this is where I'm always, we could always just look this up. So I'm going to sorry, I switched off. They're trying to make sure that this quality is high, right? And because I wasn't paying attention, what I was trying to show you was on this NCAA sports site. They kind of have the rules for exactly how this sliding scale works, right? And you could read a little bit more about it if you really want to. And I'll put that link in the slides when I post the complete version after this. I'll repost it. Okay, so they have these different requirements just to get an athletic scholarship, but they also have requirements of different athletic programs. Otherwise, those programs will incur some penalties, right? So this academic progress rate applies not only to each sport, but also to the athletic program as a whole. So how do you get this? How do you compute this APR? So schools receive a point if the athlete stays enrolled. They receive a point if the athlete stays academically ineligible, right? Or sorry, not ineligible, stays academically eligible. So you get a point if they're just continue to be enrolled at the university, a point if they're continue to be eligible. And then you compute the APR by, well, how many points were possible, right? So if you had one student, right, they could have stayed enrolled, they could have been eligible. So they count as 2 points toward the total. Now, if they did stay both of them, they would get a 2 here as well, making this 1, making the highest APR you could see is 100. But as you start adding students in here, well, maybe the next person adds 2 points total, but they didn't stay enrolled, or sorry, they became ineligible, but they stayed enrolled, so they only had 1 point to the top. Well, now it's 3 out of 4, and you fall into an APR of 750. Well, the requirement is 930, right? So you kind of see it's not just that you want to be able to keep your students eligible, especially in more recent years, and this won't be an issue moving forward with the NBA, but if you had players coming for a year and then leaving, some of them weren't enrolled at the end of the year. And so you're really concerned about this, right? I need to make sure they stay enrolled, otherwise they're going to kill my APR. So if they don't meet this requirement of 930, the first time they don't do it, they get a reprimand. Second time, they lose scholarships and practice time. Third time, they may be banned from postseason play. Fourth time, or kind of the fourth step, I shouldn't say fourth time, is that they lose their membership to the NCAA. So if we look at averages across sports, it's kind of interesting. Probably maybe what you would expect, I would say. But if we look at women's sports, let's start there. All pretty high. I don't know why women's bowling is lower. I'm guessing there's not a lot of teams here, and maybe there's just 1 or 2 bad ones, right? But you can kind of see overall, none of these sports are even close on average to being in any trouble. If you look at the averages, this is the average, remember, across men's sports, they're all pretty high as well. Although some of them are, not greatly high. But once you get to basketball, still doing pretty good. But football, right? FBS and FCS, right? I mean, this is the average, right? If the cutoff for being in trouble is 930, if this is the average, right, there's likely a school that's way up high near 100. That means there has to be a school that's down here as well to kind of balance that out. And so we potentially have some schools who aren't meeting the requirements for football. Right? They aren't meeting that 930. So let's kind of break it down and see what those schools actually look like, or who's not meeting these requirements. Right? I always thought this is kind of interesting. Like ice hockey is and gymnastics are high. This one, just anecdotally, and this is, I guess, tooting the horn of some of the students in this class, but other students I've had. Men's volleyball, I always feel like has great. I've had a lot of students who play men's volleyball here, and they always tend to do very well. So I'm not surprised by that. But anyways, I digress. So if you fail to meet this APR, I said one of the steps, after like the third time, is that you get some postseason bans. So in recent years, Alcorn State and Savannah State have both received NCAA tournament bans for basketball. For football, specific programs that have received bans, I've got the list here. And you kind of notice there are all these teams that kind of, maybe make these playing games. They're not large schools. They're probably trying to find a player, or they're trying to create a program to be competitive, but they're being a little lax on their academic standards to do so. And so eventually they're not meeting those standards. They end up with a ban. Before 2012 and 2013, the requirement was only 900. And so once they changed, so before that there was only 18 schools who had lost postseason access. So they increased it by nearly 30. The new number of schools was 42, right? So I don't know why they didn't give like a grace period of a couple years. But a lot of these programs, after they increased that standard, were really hurt, right? So maybe why you don't see as many of these smaller programs, especially in football anymore, is, think about these 24 schools who would have been okay, but then after this change, are all going to be, kind of getting this band not meeting the requirement. So if you use this website, this link, and it's not blue, but if you copy and paste into your search bar, you can actually search and see which schools haven't met this and what specific programs haven't met this in recent years, which is kind of interesting to play around with if you have a little bit of interest in that. So schools, if we think about these academic standards, how are they going to impact these schools? So why do I see these schools? I don't see like a University of Michigan or Georgia State, right? Well, what schools are likely to have more resources to attract the high quality students, right? High quality athletes. So the larger programs that I just mentioned probably attract. So when they have a huge pool of I'll give you an example. Especially back in the day, everyone wants, or even right now, every great football player, right, thinking about going to college to play, probably wants to. Alabama's a great destination, right? So they have their pick of a huge pool of players. So what can they do? Well, they're going to have two amazing quarterbacks who look identical in skill. Well, if one of them is better academically, which one am I going to choose? Well, I'm going to choose the one who's better academically. And so then what happens to the one who's not as good? Well, he falls to a lower quality school. So this kind of process would occur in this large pool to eventually, when you get down to schools like Morgan State, Savannah State, some lower quality programs, they no longer have a huge pool to choose from. If they want a high quality athlete, they're only getting the pool of high quality athletes who have lower academic quality. And so it's going to be that these smaller schools are therefore more likely to have a small pool of high quality athletes to choose from. If they do want to kind of choose that high quality athlete, they might have to take a lower quality academic student, and so it makes them more likely to become ineligible, and then having scholarships restricted. Right? So what effect would these academic standards have on competitive balance? It's likely that's going to worsen it. Right? It's likely that the higher quality schools are going to have such a large pool to choose from originally, they can also choose not only a high quality athlete, but high quality academically as well. Right? So we should see it kind of worsens not only across, but within competitive balance. Right? And studies there are a couple academic papers that have shown this, that this does have has a decreased competitive balance. Right? So I think what we're going to do tomorrow, I'm going to stop here, so 28, yeah, we'll do a shorter kind of lecture tomorrow, but we're going to talk a little bit more about what happens if we were to try to pay athletes, and kind of what impacts that would have in the league, what would that look like, talk a little bit more about the labor market. So I know today was a lot of me talking, so hopefully, what I really want you to get out of today is when I was talking about things like the type of broadcast rather than NCAA, these rewards occurring, every time I mention how it impacted across and within competitive balance, maybe kind of jot down what that was, right? So hopefully as you're taking notes, every time I said something about, well, this would, I even said at one point, this bullet point would increase across, improve across, decrease within, or whatever I said for that specific bullet point. So I really want you to think about how across and within competitive balance is impacted by a lot of the things we talked about today. I think it would be a good idea to start playing around with kind of the Excel data, along with the lecture, and so kind of using this filtering option, thinking about the types of regressions you could run with this, just giving you more data to kind of play around with and get familiar with, so that you're kind of ready to deal with your data for your project. I am going to try to get a lot of those done this week. My goal is to have all of them sent out to you. It's been quite a delay, and me trying to get things set up to do this online, or to do these recorded lectures. Things have kind of set me back this last week in terms of the restrictions that have been made just that they have on my life. So I'm still playing a little bit of catch up, but I think by the end of this week, I should have everybody's data sent to them for their project. We'll finish up the rest of the slides tomorrow. I'll film again at 1 o'clock. So I'll be on Twitch from 1 to 2:30 if you have any questions. I'll talk through our weekly reading tomorrow, which is on race and fouls. And I'll post another weekly kind of quiz tomorrow as well that'll accompany these lectures. Okay? So I will be on tomorrow at 1. I don't. Let's double check. Okay? So I'll get this posted today, and then I will post the second recording tomorrow.